Chapter 3. The Logic of Survival, Domestically. To an outside observer, the behavior of North Korean leadership often appears irrational. It seems that there is a tested and easy way out of their predicament, but for some reason they refuse to see it this way, let alone follow it. This allegedly sure and tested way is the path of Chinese-style reforms that, as many people believe, North Korean leaders will eventually follow as well. However, a closer look makes us skeptical about the advantages of the Chinese solution. It might be a good opportunity for the country, but it is too dangerous for the elite, and hence unlikely to be implemented anytime soon. Reform as collective political suicide. The history of East Asia after the Second World War was, above all, the history of spectacular economic growth. The world has not yet seen anything like this since probably the dramatic rise of Europe after the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. During the period between 1960 and 2000, the average per capita GDP growth in East Asia reached 4.6%, while the same indicator for the world was 2.8%. See Note 1. It is difficult to believe now that in 1960, in terms of per capita GDP, South Korea was slightly below Somalia, while Taiwan was lagging behind Senegal. See Note 2. This remarkable economic growth was presided over, or even brought in, by regimes that were decisively illiberal and undemocratic. These regimes are often described as developmental dictatorships, largely because they combined authoritarian politics with an obsession for economic growth. The development dictatorship strategy was pioneered by the military regime in South Korea and by Taiwan. The latter, between 1945 and 1988, was a one-party hereditary dictatorship, a bit like North Korea. These regimes, combined with anti-communist rhetoric and some lip service to the principles of the free world, with a market-driven but government-controlled developmental strategy. Lacking natural resources, they emphasized cheap labor and economic efficiency, and they were successful beyond anybody's wildest expectations. From the mid-1980s, this first generation of developmental dictatorships was emulated by communist regimes in mainland China and Vietnam. In both countries, the Communist Party elite kept the old slogans and quasi-Leninist decorum for the sake of domestic stability, but for all practical purposes switched to the developmental model pioneered by Taiwan and South Korea. If anything, their version of capitalism was even more unabashed and brutal. The quasi-communist regimes treated labor with greater harshness and demonstrated a remarkable indifference to the yawning gap between the rich and poor. The model worked again, and so the second generation of developmental dictatorships also achieved spectacular results. Suffice it to say that Vietnam, which experienced a famine in the mid-1980s, by the mid-1990s became the world's third largest exporter of rice. See Note 3. Thus, in China and Vietnam, and technically, the communist oligarchy presided over an unprecedented economic growth while successfully maintaining domestic stability and enormously enriching themselves in the process. They can see themselves, with good reasons, as benefactors and even saviors of their countries, and also enjoy the power and comfort that was beyond the dreams of their mentors, who began their careers in the brutal and austere times of Mao and Ho Chi Minh. This option seems to be irresistibly attractive, but it has failed to inspire the North Korean elite. Over the last 2 decades, at every sign of changes in the North, a number of newspaper columnists and academic commentators alike assured the readers, and perhaps even themselves, that the unavoidable has finally happened, and that the long overdue reforms have started at last. Such enthusiastic commentaries greeted the Joint Enterprise Law of 1984, the launch of Rajin Sonbong Special Economic Zone in the early 1990s, and the so-called 7.1 measures of 2002. I recall an article from 2003, written by a professor of marketing from Indiana, entitled, "North Korea Moving from Isolation to Open Market Economy. Is it time to invest or continue observing?" Predictably, the suggestion was to invest before it was too late. To give the author his due, however, he did include some cautious warnings. See Note 4. Terence Rohrig from the U.S. Naval War College, expressing fairly typical sentiments of opportunistic outsiders, said recently, Quote, "To avoid the potential dangers of sudden collapse in the DPRK, it may be a better route to promote a long-term, gradual transition that seeks to encourage the forces within North Korea and the ruling regime for change. Whether that regime is another member of the Kim family or a military party collective of some sort, to further a process of economic opening and reform could lead to a subsequent path of political modernization and reform." Unquote. See Note 5. Rohrig might be right when he is saying this. Cynically speaking, it makes sense to persuade the Pyongyang leaders that they would have a bright future in a reformed North Korea. However, they have not shown much inclination to be persuaded by this siren song, and some suspect that the reforms would become their shortcut to ruin and self-destruction. Regrettably, they are very likely correct in this assumption. Unfortunately for the common North Koreans, the Pyongyang leaders' unwillingness to emulate China has very rational explanations. North Korean leaders stubbornly resist reform not because they are ideological zealots who blindly believe in prescriptions of the Juche idea. They do not, and the idea itself is too nebulous to be a guide to a practical policy anyway. Nor because they are ignorant of the outside world. They are neither irrational nor ideological. On the contrary, they are rational to the extreme, being perhaps the most perfect bunch of Machiavellians currently in operation. The North Korean leaders do not want reforms because they realize that in the specific conditions produced by the division of their country, such reforms are potentially destabilizing and, if judged from the ruling elite's point of view, constitute the surest way of political, and perhaps physical, suicide. The existence of rich and free South Korea is what makes North Korea's situation so different from that of China or Vietnam. The regime lives next to a country whose people speak the same language and are officially described as members of our own nation, but who enjoy a per capita income of at least 15 times, some claim even 40 times, higher than that of the North Koreans. See Note 6. Even if the lowest estimate is believed, it is still by far the world's largest per capita income difference between two countries that share a land border. To put things in perspective, the income ratio in divided Germany was merely 1 to 3, and even this was enough to prompt the East Germans to overthrow the regime as soon as they had an opportunity to do so without fear of Soviet retribution. If ordinary North Koreans become fully aware of the prosperity their brethren enjoy only a mere 100 miles or so away, the regime's legitimacy would suffer a major blow, and quite likely become untenable. One can only imagine the mind-blowing effect that might be produced by the sight of the average Seoul street, a typical South Korean department store, or, for that matter, the flat of a humble, semi-skilled manual worker. Perhaps 15 years of flourishing market activities somehow have made North Koreans immune to the sights of consumerist abundance at shops. After all, one can buy a lot in North Korea now, if and when money is available. But one can easily imagine what will happen to a North Korean's mind when he or she discovers that a South Korean worker, supposedly a slave of American neo-colonialism, enjoys the amenities and lifestyle that in North Korea are available only for a tiny minority to people like successful drug smugglers or Central Committee officials. Reforms worked in Vietnam and China because their situation is different. Simply put, Chinese reforms succeeded because there is not a prosperous South China, whose size would be comparable with that of the China or of the Communist Party. The prosperity of, for example, Japan or the United States is well known in China, to be sure, but is not seen by common Chinese as politically relevant. After all, those are different nations, with different histories. So the remarkable prosperity does not necessarily demonstrate the inefficiency of Communist Party rule. And of course, China is not going to join the United States, becoming its 51st state. Neither Vietnam nor China has a rich other which seek unification. Taiwan is too small to have a palpable impact on the average Chinese income in the event of unification, and South Vietnam ceased to exist in 1975. Thus, for the time being, the common Chinese seemingly accept the same bargain accepted by the South Koreans or Taiwanese of the 1960s. They put up with authoritarian rule as long as they enjoy stability and economic growth. In North Korea, due to the allure of rich and free South, such a bargain has very thin chances of success, and the Pyongyang leaders of Kim Jong-il's generation were well aware of this. Reform is possible without a considerable relaxation of information blockade and daily surveillance. Foreign investment and technology are necessary preconditions for growth. Consequently, if Chinese-style reform was to be instigated, a large number of North Koreans would soon be exposed to dangerous knowledge of the outside world, and above all, of South Korea. A considerable relaxation of surveillance would be unavoidable as well. Efficient market reforms cannot occur in a country where a business trip to the capital city requires a weeks-long wait for travel permits, and where promotion is determined not so much by labor efficiency, but by demonstrated political loyalty, including the ability to memorize the lengthy speeches of the dear leader. Relaxation would entail information flowing within the country, and thus the dissemination of this information, as well as dangerous conclusions drawn from it, would become much easier. The situation is further aggravated by the recent dramatic improvement of the IT technologies, which make censorship even more difficult and therefore constitute a major political threat to the regime. It is doubtful whether the North Korean population would acquiesce to enduring a further decade of destitution, followed by a couple of decades of relative poverty and backbreaking work if they were to learn about another Korea. Affluent, free, glamorous, and attractive. Would they agree to tolerate a reforming but still authoritarian and repressive regime on the assumption that this regime will on some distant day deliver a prosperity comparable to that of present-day South Korea? The North Koreans, unfortunately for their leaders, are much more likely to react to the new knowledge and new freedom in a different way, by removing the current regime and unifying with South Korea in order to partake in the fabulous prosperity of the wildly rich South. One can easily imagine how discontent with the North Korean system, as well as information about the astonishing South Korean prosperity, will spread. First, through the relatively well-heeled North Korean groups who are suddenly allowed to interact with South Koreans and foreigners, or who have better access to foreign media and entertainment, and then down the wider social strata. Once North Koreans come to the conclusion that they have no reason to be afraid of the usual crackdown, they are very likely to do what the East Germans did in 1989. There is another important difference between North Korea and China, and once again, this difference is created by the existence of the successful South. It is an open secret that Chinese party officials used the reforms to enrich themselves. The new Chinese entrepreneurial class, to a significant extent, consists of former officials as well as their relations and buddies. The situation in the post-communist countries of the USSR and Eastern Europe is no different. With few exceptions, the political and economic life of those countries is dominated by the former second-tier party apparatchiks, who once used their connections, experience, education, and above all, their de facto control over the state assets to appropriate the government property and remake themselves into successful capitalists and or politicians. It might just be a minor exaggeration to describe the collapse of communism as a management buyout, as Richard Vinin did recently. See Note 7. On balance, in the 1990s, the younger generations of Eastern European and Soviet nomenclatura jettisoned the system they never actually believed in, while enormously increasing their wealth, if not power, in the process. See Note 8. However, the situation of North Korean elites is different. They stand little chance of becoming successful capitalists if the system is overthrown. In all probability, the regime collapse will be followed by the unification of the peninsula. After all, this is what the common people will likely want, on the mistaken assumption that unification will instantly deliver them the same level of consumption as enjoyed by their southern brethren. In such a case, all the important positions in the new economy will undoubtedly be taken by people from South Korea. People with capital, education, experience, and perhaps political support. The capitalism in the post-unification North is to be built not by born-again apparatchiks, as was the case in the former USSR, but rather by resident managers of LG and Samsung, as well as assorted carpetbaggers from Seoul. The fact is understood by at least some North Korean bureaucrats, but it seems that the majority has another greater fear. They know how brutal their rule has been. They also know how they would treat the South Korean elite, and their descendants, had the North won the intra-Korean feud, and do not see reasons why they would be treated differently by actual winners. This makes them very afraid of retribution. They are not merely afraid to lose power and access to material privileges. These privileges are quite modest, incidentally, by the standards of the rich in most other countries. They are afraid of being slaughtered or sent to prisons, of suffering the same fate they have bestowed on their enemies for decades. A few years ago, a high-level North Korean bureaucrat with an unusual frankness told a high-level Western diplomat, quote, "The human rights and the like might be a great idea, but if we start explaining it to our people, we will be killed in no time," unquote. This seems to be a common assumption. That it is also not coincidental that many visitors to Pyongyang, including the present author, had to answer the same question quietly asked by their minders. What has happened to former East German party and police officials? Perhaps one of the reasons behind the remarkable resilience of the North Korean regime is this universal assumption of its bureaucrats, including those who are quite low in the pecking order, that they would have no future in case of regime collapse. This makes North Korea different from many other dictatorships. A clerk in Mubarak's Egypt, for example, could assume that, Democrats or not, Islamists or not, under a new regime he would still sit at his desk and continue the old routine of, say, issuing permits for house construction. Ditto a high-ranking military officer who also would expect that under a new government in Cairo he would still command his battalion. Consequently, they did not see the revolution as a personal threat, and might have even been supportive of the movement. In North Korea, things are different. The elite, pretty much everybody who is somebody, believe that it has nothing to gain and much to lose through unification with the South. These fears might be, and indeed are, exaggerated, but they are by no means groundless. It is important that their predicament stems from the existence of a successful South, not from particular policies followed by a specific Seoul administration. Even if the most pro-North Korean administration imaginable will come to power in Seoul, it will not make South Korea less dangerous. Perhaps, as we will see later, a friendly South Korea is actually more dangerous, even though this fact might not be currently appreciated in Pyongyang. This reconstruction of the Pyongyang elite's thinking is necessarily hypothetical, but an impressive confirmation of this hypothesis has emerged recently. This confirmation came from Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-il's oldest son, who lives overseas in semi-exile, largely in Macao and continental China. Kim Jong-nam is the only member of the Kim family who talks to foreign journalists. They occasionally manage to intercept him in an airport or a lobby or of an expensive hotel. With the passage of time, his short interviews have become more substantive in content and more politically frank. In 2010, he even went so far as to openly voice his disapproval of the hereditary power transfer at that point developing in Pyongyang. His remarks became even more candid in recent years, and in January 2011 he gave a lengthy interview to Yoji Gomi, a journalist for Tokyo Shinbun. Soon afterward, it was revealed that since 2004, the maverick North Korean prince had maintained email exchanges with Gomi, who published these emails in a book. The single most important topic in this book is the impossibility of Chinese-style reforms in North Korea. Kim Jong-nam has clearly stated his belief that market-oriented reforms would probably revive the North Korean economy. In one case, addressing his half-brother Kim Jong-un, by that time already successor to Kim Jong-il, he implored him to have pity on the common people and follow the Chinese example. However, in many other cases, Kim Jong-nam is far less certain about the potential positive impact of reforms. In his January 2011 interview, he said, "I personally believe that economic reforms and openness are the best ways to make life better for the North Korean people. However, taking North Korea's unique position into account, there is a fear that economic reforms and openness will lead to the collapse of the present system." In the same interview, Kim Jong-nam repeated the same point. The North Korean leadership is stuck in a bind. Without reforms, the country's economy will go bankrupt, but reforms are fraught with the danger of system collapse. See Note 9. This is a remarkably forthright but completely reasonable admission, and unfortunately it confirms that the North Korean leaders understand perfectly well how dangerous the reforms would be for their survival. In such a case, what is the best policy choice for the North Korean elite? The optimal course of action appears to be a continuation of the policies the current leaders and their predecessors have followed for the last 2 decades. Domestically, the regime's policy aim has been to keep the North Korean population under control, compartmentalized, and above all, isolated from the outside world. Internationally, the safest solution is an aid-maximizing strategy, which includes attempts to squeeze more aid outside through diplomacy and blackmail. See Note 10. This foreign aid helps to keep the inherently inefficient economy afloat, prevents another major famine, and allows the country's tiny elite to live a reasonably luxurious lifestyle, while buying at least some support from strategically important social groups. The aid was first distributed to the military, the police, and then the populations of major urban centers. See Note 11. Judged from the point of view of leaders in Pyongyang, this policy has become a success. They remain in control and enjoy a privileged life, even today in 2013, while a majority of the more liberal and permissive communist regimes have long been overthrown. By keeping the system unchanged and restraining the spontaneous growth of the private market-based economy, the North Korean elite has probably forfeited the chance to achieve sustainable economic growth. However, growth is not their major concern. They do not mind growth, to be sure, but only as long as it does not jeopardize the more important goals of maintaining the political instability and their own domination. They would be happy to see a North Korean economic boom, as long as they are not going to enjoy this wonderful picture through the window grate of their cell. The international media often engage in the endless and useless speculations about the factional struggle in Pyongyang, telling us about the technocrats, who also known as pragmatists, who allegedly fight the conservative ideologues and military hardliners. Such struggle might indeed go on, even though most media reports are often based on speculations and unreliable hearsay. However, the oft-repeated description of the alleged reformers as pragmatists is misleading. If such people actually did exist, they are better described as dangerous idealists or starry-eyed romanticists, whose reformist program, if ever carried out, will hasten the regime's demise and lead to their own downfall, which would be good for a majority of North Koreans, but this is altogether a different matter. Pyongyang reformers will face a sad, should we say tragic, paradox. No matter how successful their reforms will be if judged in objective terms, the majority of North Koreans would still perceive even the most brilliant success as a failure when using the fabulously rich South as the natural benchmark. However, even if reform-minded individuals exist, they are a minority. What the mainstream North Korean elite want is to return to the year 1984. Not that of the Orwellian dystopia, but the last year when Kim Il-sung's system was still functioning properly, though admittedly the properly functioning Kim Il-sung society had a number of remarkable similarities with an Orwellian dystopia. The economic policies of the regime are largely driven by the desire to revive the hyper-Stalinist model of the past. It is possible that many people on the top sincerely hope that this model might somehow work, but even if they do not succumb to such fantasies, they still have no choice. Due to the existence of the rich South, the hyper-centralized and highly controlled Stalinist economy seems to be only the type compatible with maintaining political stability. Putting the genie back in the bottle. Not so successful crackdowns on market activity. When we describe the North Korean capitalism from below, it is important to remember that most of the new entrepreneurial activities have been technically illegal, even if the government is willing to turn a blind eye to what is happening at the marketplace. In the midst of the famine, North Korean authorities still sporadically cracked down on markets and so-called capitalist profiteering. Usually such crackdowns ended in naught, being quietly sabotaged by the low-level officials who either depended on markets themselves or understood that excessive pressure was likely to further aggravate the already disastrous situation. In 2002, however, Pyongyang's negative attitude towards the emerging market economy appeared to change. On July 1, 2002, North Korean leaders introduced a set of measures that are frequently described in the foreign media as the 2002 reforms. With the word reform regarded as too radical, even subversive, the state media never accepted this description, and the policy is officially known in Korea as the 7.1 measures, that is, July 1 measures. See Note 12. As usually happens at the first sight of any change in North Korea's policies, the measures were heralded overseas as the sign of the long-awaited reforms and received an enthusiastic reception in the international media. This started a wave of the usual speculations about North Korea finally doing the right thing and turning the Chinese way. Newspaper headlines were sanguine with "Little choice, Stalinist North Korea lets markets emerge," signs that North Korea is coming to the market, and "North Korea experiments with China as its model." See Note 13. This optimism was completely unfounded, as we will see later. The 7.1 measures are in fact included The 7.1 measures in fact included several different sets of policies. First, consumer prices were raised dramatically. For example, for decades, rice was sold within the PDS at purely token price of 0.08 North Korean won per kilogram. After the reforms, the price increased by a multiple of 550 to 44 won per kilogram, approximating the market price at the time. Official wages increased as well, albeit on a smaller scale. According to the Yim Kyung-hoon's calculations, retail prices on average increased by a multiple of 25, whereas wages increased merely by a multiple of 18. See Note 14. Second, the 7.1 measures introduced changes in the management of state companies that increased the power and independence of company managers. Not only were managers allowed to use the market to acquire resources and sell finished products, but they were also given more freedom to design incentives for workers, like, say, a right to pay performance bonuses. Third, the 7.1 measures envisioned the establishment of general markets, Chonghap Shijang, a move that in foreign media was often described, misleadingly, as lifting the ban on private market trade. Of course, one could not possibly lift a ban that never existed, as by 2002 a majority of North Koreans were already earning their living through private market activity of some kind. The formal establishment of general markets was less significant a change than it might have appeared. Essentially, it was a belated and grudging acceptance of what the government knew it could not control. One might be surprised to learn that the majority of market vendors whom the present author interviews regularly, many dozens of people, simply have no idea about any reform happening in 2002. They did not hear about the measures that supposedly legalized their businesses and changed their lives. And with good reason. The much-hyped measures had little impact on the actual working of the markets, apart from the changing their official name and making them, eventually, a bit more regulated. The vendors continued to do what they had been doing for years. Nonetheless, the 7.1 measures and associated policies indicated that Pyongyang leadership acknowledged and, to an extent, accepted spontaneous de-Stalinization from below. This relaxation did not last long, however. Soon afterwards, the North Korean authorities began their attempts to reverse the changes that had spontaneously occurred in the previous decade. This approach might be bad for the economic growth, but it is good for the political stability that is Pyongyang's overwhelming concern. The North Korean leaders understand that spontaneous liberalization was dangerous and never felt at ease about the markets. Thus, in 2005, they decided that this was the time to launch a decisive offensive against the informal economy. By that time, the famine was over, even though malnourishment remained widespread, and still is. A large role in the economic recovery was played by the generous foreign aid. However, it would be an oversimplification to think that it was foreign aid alone that put an end to the disaster of the late 1990s. The partial recovery was helped by the emergence of the private economy, private fields in particular, and the adjustment of what remained to the state sector, of the state sector. Improved harvest played a role too. The North Korean government saw this mild but palpable improvement as a sign that it could do what it wanted to do, revive the pre-crisis system. As an interesting illustration of this attitude, consider a remark made by a North Korean official in October 2005. When asked by a visiting South Korean scholar whether the government indeed had restarted the rationing system, the official replied, "Now, when we have a good harvest and plentiful reserves of rice, are the private sales of rice at the market necessary?" Unquote. See Note 15. The underlying assumption is clear. Ideally, the economy should be based on administrative distribution and rationing, whereas markets and retail trade should be tolerated only as a means of coping with emergencies. In October of 2005, roughly the above-quoted conversation took place. The government announced that the long-defunct PDS, Public Distribution System, would be restored in full, albeit with some modifications. The North Korean populace was assured that from now on, everybody would be given standard rations on a regular basis as had occurred under Kim Il-sung. The price of rations was fixed at the post-2002 official level. Rice, for example, was 44 won per kilogram. By the time of the announcement, however, the actual market price for rice had already reached 800 and 900 won, and by 2009 was fluctuating around the 2000 won mark, so the new PDS price was 44 won per kilogram still remained a token. See note 16. The decision to reinstitute the PDS was accomplished by the revival of the government's monopoly on grain purchases. It was said that private trade in grain would be banned, or rather, authorities reconfirmed the ban that had technically existed since 1957, was never formally lifted, but ceased to be enforced in the early 1990s. The attempted revival of the PDS was presented as a sign of a return to normality, and was officially referred to in the North Korean parlance as the normalization of food distribution. Most of the North Korean populace would agree with this description. After all, a majority of the North Koreans would have lived most of their lives under the PDS, and indeed would perceive the system as normal. The revival proved to be a very partial success. In subsequent years, the rations began to diminish again. As of 2012, anyone living outside Pyongyang has to be an official or work at a military plant in order to get a full or nearly full ration. The ban on private sale of grain lasted merely a few months. By late 2006, rice and corn were again sold and bought freely, as the police and low-level officials were unwilling to enforce the new regulations. As we will see below, this was a typical outcome of many attempts to revive the old patterns. The government efforts seldom meet open resistance, but are quietly sabotaged by the low-ranking officials and population alike. Attempts to regulate or limit market activities intensified after 2005. In December 2006, authorities prohibited the able-bodied males from engaging in market trade. Men were allowed to trade at markets only if the aspiring vendor was not the primary breadwinner of the household, but a dependent. See note 17. Indeed, in Kim Il-sung's North Korea, all men were expected to work a proper job, that is, to be employed in the government sector. There is a rational, indeed very rational, reason behind this seemingly bizarre policy of keeping workers at non-functioning factories. The North Korean surveillance system operates on the assumption that every adult has a proper job with a state-run enterprise. Thus, indoctrination and police surveillance are centered on the workplace, where the entire organizational life takes place. The ban did not have much impact, however, on actual market activities, since men settled trade in North Korea. Conversely, the government's decision a year later in December of 2007 to extend the ban on market trade to women below 50 years of age was much more important. See note 18. The decision reportedly led to riots in March 2008, particularly in the city of Chongjin. For a brief while, the police and officials tried to enforce the ban, so the younger female vendors had to use a number of tricks. The most common way to evade regulations was to bring along an elderly mother-in-law or other aged female relative when going to the market. If police asked questions, the vendor explained that it was actually her highly esteemed mother-in-law who did trading, while she just dropped by to briefly help the old lady. This ruse could work, admittedly, only as long as the police were not too serious about enforcing the ban, and this was actually the case. Within a few months, the ban was forgotten completely. Once again, the quiet resistance won. Nonetheless, the North Korean government did not give up, and in late 2008 prepared a decisive move against the markets. In November, the local authorities were officially notified that beginning in 2009, the private markets would be allowed to operate only 3 days every month. No sales of industrial goods would be allowed on the markets either. The leadership made explicitly clear that improvement of the North Korean economic and social situation would make markets obsolete. See note 20. At the last moment, however, the plan was cancelled. The backlash, however, was not limited to the markets. After 2005, authorities increased control over the porous border with China. This led to a dramatic decline in the number of refugees hiding in China, falling from estimates of 200,000 in 1998 to a mere 20,000 to 40,000 in 2010. See note 21. Although a number of factors, including improvement of the food situation, contributed to this dramatic drop in refugees, increased efficiency of the North Korean border control played a major role. It has become far more difficult to cross the border river without bribing the border guards. The anti-market policies of North Korean authorities culminated in the currency reform of 2009. It was designed to destroy the unruly markets once and forever. However, it shared the fate of the earlier anti-market measures. It failed, and this failure was quite spectacular. Salaries. What was the average income of a North Korean in the 1980s, and how much does he or she earn nowadays? These two questions sound natural and commonplace, but are rather difficult to answer, largely because wages in North Korea play a dramatically different role to that of wages in capitalist or even Soviet-style socialist economy. That said, in nominal terms, the question is simple enough. In the 1980s, the average monthly salary of a North Korean was 70 to 80 North Korean won. In subsequent years, it rose to a level of some 100 won in 2000. After 2002 reform, salaries were increased dramatically, reaching the average level of 3,000 won, and have remained at that level ever since. Nowadays, North Korean workers draw salaries in the range from 1,500 to 6,000 won. The official exchange rate of the North Korean won is now fixed at 135 won per US dollar. But the market rate seems to be far more indicative, since currently the market rate fluctuates around the 3,400 won per US dollar mark. The official salary is equivalent to 50 cents and $1.75 a month. For the Kim Il-sung era, the application of the then market exchange rate would mean that the average salary of 71 would be roughly equivalent to some $20. But these figures are essentially meaningless and even misleading. Under Kim Il-sung, North Korea was a rationing economy par excellence. Everything was rationed, and the state, being the sole employer in the nation's economy, decided how much grain a worker should eat every day, usually 700 grams. But how much soy sauce he or she would be allowed to have, and how often pork or fresh apples should appear on the average North Korean's table. Markets existed, but the vast majority of North Koreans in Kim Il-sung's era satisfied their consumption demands through the state-run distribution system. The North Koreans of the era, however, did not necessarily see the public distribution system as a system of control. For them, it was often seen as a social welfare system, but because rations were subsidized heavily almost to the point of being free. For example, the price of grain within the public distribution center was fixed between 0.04 and 0.08 won. The entire standard food ration, cereals, soy sauce, some vegetables, and a few eggs and fish, in the 1980s cost between 5 and 10 won per month, or in other words, some 10% of the then average monthly salary. In the North Korea of Kim Il-sung era, that is, before early 1990s, a wage was little different from pocket money. People could use it to buy stationery or movie tickets and satisfy other supplementary needs, while essential goods and services were provided all but exclusively through the rationing system. The best equivalent might be military service. A soldier in a conscript army is supposed to fight and work, while the state is expected to take care of his reasonable consumption needs and provide him with a certain amount of pocket money. Among other things, this system created a remarkable degree of material equality. No doubt, even in the Kim Il-sung era, officials lived much better than the average person, but in most cases, living standards were remarkably uniform across the country and social groups. Even for officials, their privileges came not from higher salaries, but from access to special distribution points. There, they were issued items unavailable to normal people, like chocolate and cigarettes with filters. Rations stopped being delivered between 1993 and 1995, the people discovering that in the new situation they had to rely on the market in order to obtain all food. This was not easy because from the mid-1990s the average monthly salary would suffice to buy merely 2 kilos of rice. In 2002, the state attempted to change the system by increasing the official price of rice to the then market level. while also dramatically increasing salaries to partially compensate for the hike. Obviously, North Korean economic planners did not realize the consequences of a dramatic increase in the supply of money. After a few months of hyperinflation, the price of rice stabilized to compensate for the increase in cash supply, and North Korean workers now paid some 3,000 won instead of 100 won a month. Discovered that they could afford to buy the same 2 or 3 kilos of rice. No wonder the North Koreans turned to a great variety of activities to earn the necessary cash to buy the necessities of life. Now, in 2012, the refugees agree that the survival income for a family of 3 or 4 is 50,000 won, some $15 according to the current exchange rate, roughly 10 times the official salary. So it is no surprise that salary is not seen as a major indicator of one's income and prosperity. A disaster that almost happened, the currency reform of 2009. In late 2009, Korean leaders decided to inflict a major blow to the market system, wiping out capitalist activities and punishing independent entrepreneurs, also known as shameless anti-socialist profiteers, while also rewarding those few who remained loyal to the party and the leader in the midst of the turmoil. Judging by some peculiarities that occurred during subsequent events, it seems that it was not so much the faceless leadership, but rather Kim Jong-il himself, who was the mastermind behind the botched counter-reform of 2009. In 2009, the North Korean leaders used a well-known policy device, currency reform. Such reforms have been part of life in all communist countries, but similar measures have been used in market economies to curb hyperinflation. The Soviet currency reform of 1947, initiated by Joseph Stalin himself, can be seen as an archetypal operation of this type. The Soviet reform was later emulated by communist regimes, including North Korea, which underwent reforms of this type in 1959, 1979, and 1992. The reform scenario is well known. One day, usually in the morning, the population suddenly learns that old banknotes are to become useless in a few days, and should be swapped for the new banknotes. For note exchange, strict limits are set. For cash, the limits are usually equal to a couple of monthly salaries, while money in the bank accounts usually is treated with greater leniency and can be exchanged in somewhat greater quantities, but still within limits. The exchange period is made deliberately short, usually a few days only, and the number of places where exchanges can be made is also limited. The intended result of such a policy is a dramatic reduction in the money supply, which is very good for curbing inflation. In communist countries which tended to embrace this kind of currency reform, the policy had an important added benefit. It wiped out illegal savings of black market operators. People who lived on their official salaries and or tended to keep money in government-controlled banks suffered as well, but to a far lesser extent when compared to the sorry fate of those involved in unsanctioned economic activities. Accordingly, on the morning of November 30th, at 11 a.m. to be exact, the North Korean populace learned that old banknotes would go out of circulation. As was often the case with such reforms, it was accompanied with devaluation. 2 zeros from the North Korean paper currency, the won, had been lopped off, so 100 new won were supposed to buy as much merchandise as 10,000 old won did. This would make the prices roughly similar to what they used to be in the early 1990s, just before the collapse of the state-run economy. The change of the banknotes had to be completed with less than a week, and the exchange limit was initially set at 100,000 old won per person, equivalent to $30 of the then ongoing exchange rate. Panic ensued, since many North Koreans, especially those involved in private economic activities, had significant amounts of cash holdings in North Korean currency. Many a private company faced collapse, as was intended by the reform planners. The North Korean currency reform of 2009 had one striking peculiarity, however, which made it different from its prototypes and doomed it to failure. It was declared that all people who were employed by state-run factories and institutions, that is, virtually all those legally employed in the economy, would receive the same amount in the new currency in wages as they did in the old currency. This measure effectively constituted a hundredfold, that is, 10,000% overnight increase in salaries and wages. Take, for example, the case of a skilled worker who dutifully attended his or her non-functioning factory and was before the currency reform paid 3,500 won per month. After the reform, the worker was still to be paid 3,500 won per month. At the same time, the price of all goods and services was supposed to go down 100-fold. For example, the price of rice was officially fixed to the level of 22 new won per kilo, instead of pre-reform level of 1,800 to 2,000. This, theoretically, implied that his new 3,500 won would buy as much as the old 350,000 won. For a while, foreign observers were taken aback by such a seemingly irrational move and speculated about the secret designs behind the plan, or even refused to believe that the first reports about the promised 10,000% rise of wages. However, it soon became clear that no secret design existed, and that reports were true indeed. Obviously, the people who approved the plan did not quite understand that by increasing salaries 100-fold overnight, they would produce a tidal wave of inflation, and not a dramatic increase of living standards. North Korea has undergone currency reforms a number of times, and its financial experts were aware of similar reforms elsewhere. So one cannot help but wonder how such a bizarre feature made its way into the reform plan. One can speculate the planners initially intended to follow the well-established pattern and launch a standard confiscatory currency reform. That is, a reform in which most of the cash deposits would be appropriated by the state, and both salaries and retail prices would be decreased in equal proportions. However, it seems likely that at the last moment somebody intervened and ordered a dramatic revision of the plan, suggesting dramatically increase official salaries. The person who suggested this was unbelievably naive, not to say ignorant, about the fundamental workings of an economy, where human beings have to divide limited resources and are not able to simply create resources with paper alone. One should not be so surprised by such naivete. Taking into consideration the mechanics of the North Korean state, such a decision had to be initiated, or at least personally approved, by Kim Jong-il himself. The North Korean ruler has never in his life had to worry about paying for groceries or saving for a new car, let alone for a rainy day. Kim Jong-il was indeed a brilliant power broker and a world-class diplomatic manipulator, but he had a reputation for being almost comically incompetent in matters of economic management, and the 2009 reform confirmed this widespread opinion. One can easily imagine how the dear leader would look through a currency reform plan and say, "And what about poor wage earners? Should we not reward the people who remained loyal to the socialist industry and did not go for black markets? Why not increase their salaries so they will become affluent, more affluent than those anti-socialist profiteers of the black market?" One would imagine that few, if any, officials would dare explain the dire economic consequences of such generosity to the dear leader. From the first few hours, the currency reforms took a very messy turn indeed. People rushed to save their earnings and savings, and panic buying ensued. In a sense, this was expected to happen, but the scale of panic was unusual. To placate the situation, the authorities adjusted the rules, increasing maximum exchange limits, but this did not help. Unfortunately, further actions merely exacerbated the crisis. The authorities obviously supposed that the PDS would start functioning immediately, delivering the rations to the masses, but this did not and could not happen. As one would expect, inflation began to speed up. For a while, the government kept issuing restrictions on the maximum market price for essential goods. For example, rice should not be sold for more than 24 won per kilo. The market ignored these regulations. In rare cases, when the regulations were enforced by the police, nobody was going to sell at the price that was well below the market equilibrium, so goods disappeared. In an attempt to rein in the chaos, and perhaps to punish stubborn merchants and vendors, the regime closed all markets in December. In early January 2010, hard currency shops where the elite and new rich could buy quality goods were closed as well. This latter decision delivered a blow to the highly privileged groups of the population. In January, it did not necessarily help to be an army general, a spy master, or a successful antique dealer. Even these people would have trouble getting daily food for their families. For a brief while in January and February 2010, a major outbreak of public discontent seemed to be within the limits of the possible. The dissatisfaction was expressed with unprecedented frankness. It was the first time in decades even highly privileged members of the Pyongyang elite openly criticized their government's actions while talking to foreigners. Russian students in Pyongyang were approached by their classmates who did not bother to hide their anger about the currency reform, and North Korean diplomats sometimes made pointed comments to their foreign opposite numbers. A military attaché of one Western country, not exactly friendly from the North Korean point of view, told me that his opposite numbers related that the North Korean government doesn't quite understand what it's doing. One can imagine how angry a military intelligence officer in one of the world's most controlled societies has to be in order to share his frustration with an imperialist outsider. It is not coincidental that around this time, rumors about the impending collapse of North Korea began to spread. To an extent, these rumors were probably circulated by South Korean conservatives then in control in Seoul. But the sense of insecurity was briefly shared by many people who had first-hand access to Pyongyang, not least by Chinese whose unease was palpable in those days. But nothing serious happened. By April, it was business as usual, almost. Foreign currency shops and private markets were reopened in February. The rich and powerful stopped complaining, and the humbler folks resumed their usual economic activities, which lay well outside the shrinking government-controlled sphere. In the aftermath of the reforms fiasco, the government withdrew all restrictions that had been introduced in the 2005 to 2009 anti-market campaigns. The local authorities were explicitly ordered in May of 2010 not to intervene with the daily workings of markets, as long as politically dangerous items, like South Korean DVDs, were not on sale. It was again unofficially permitted to sell grain at the market price, and traders regardless of age or gender were allowed to conduct business as much as they liked. Obviously, the government again implicitly admitted that North Korea in its present shape could not exist without active markets, its hyper-Stalinistic rhetoric notwithstanding. There were talks that the North Korean premier, soon to be ousted from his job, apologized for mistakes when talking behind closed doors to a gathering of officials in Pyongyang. There were also widespread rumors that Pak Nam-gi, a high-level KWP official responsible for economic policy, was executed for his counter-revolutionary activities and espionage. Allegedly, the old bureaucrat was accused of being a lifelong American spy who deliberately mishandled the reform in order to inflict damage on the North Korean economy. Both rumors were widely reported in the international media, and might be true indeed, but one should keep in mind that neither was confirmed by the North Korean official sources. There is nothing surprising about its silence. However strange it might appear to the reader, the entire issue of the currency reform was never mentioned in open-access North Korean media. When the entire country was in an unprecedented state of chaos, not a single article in the official newspapers even mentioned what was going on. All information and instructions reached the North Korean populace through classified channels. Notices were put on boards at the banks, markets, and shops, and announcements were occasionally made over cable radio, whose programming could not be heard by outsiders, and often differed from one neighbor to another. References to currency reform in official media could be found only in the types of media that are inaccessible to the average North Korean and exclusively target a foreign audience, like, for example, the pro-North Korean newspaper in Japan, Chosun Shinbo. The government succeeded in getting the political situation under control, but it could not do much about the law of supply and demand. Thus, a tidal wave of inflation rose immediately after the reform, and what else would one expect after an effective 10,000% overnight increase in wages and salaries? Within a few months, the four-digit inflation wiped out whatever little gains state employees had received from the entire operation. By late 2010, the price of food and consumption goods stabilized at roughly the same level as before the currency reform, which could have been predicted by anyone who ever took Economics 101. In essence, the bold attempt to deny the law of supply and demand ended pretty much like a challenge to the law of gravity would. It remains to be seen, however, whether North Korean leaders have learned their lesson. The level of economic ignorance they have demonstrated in 2009 makes one suspect that the Kim family, and perhaps many of their top advisors, cannot grasp even the basic mechanisms that govern a functioning economic system. Admittedly, this ignorance about modern economics does not prevent them from being shrewd politicians who recognize what they need to do in order to stay in power. They know how to maintain a world where they and their families will have no need to worry about such mundane matters as paying their bills. Nevertheless, it is possible that the North Korean leaders have learned a thing or two from their dangerous encounter with the world market economy. Beginning in May 2010, attempts to reverse the marketization was abruptly stopped, and for the following years the markets were left alone. In essence, the government, burned by their 2009 failure, returned to the policy of the late 1990s. While markets are not endorsed, they are for practical purposes tolerated. The belated rise of a new star general. Since the early 1970s, North Korea had a family dictatorship, an absolute monarchy in everything but name. Consequently, it was almost universally expected that in order to maintain the stability of the Kim family regime, Kim Jong-il would eventually anoint one of his sons as successor. Rumors about a coming succession have widely circulated in the media since the mid-1990s. International media outlets occasionally run stories where, whilst citing well-informed sources inside North Korea, they claimed that Kim Jong-il had just made a decision about the succession. In discussing Kim Jong-il's alleged choice, the media named a number of alleged approved candidates, including all three known sons of Kim Jong-il, his brother-in-law, his sister, his daughter, his current mistress. But until 2008, all these reports were proven to be false. For some reason, Kim Jong-il was not in a hurry to anoint an heir designate. For some reason, Kim Jong-il was not in a hurry to anoint an heir designate until almost the end of his reign. For a while during the 1990s, people expected that Kim Jong-il would choose his eldest son, Kim Jong-nam, as a successor. This didn't happen, however. In May 2001, Kim Jong-nam was apprehended by the Japanese Immigration Service when he tried to enter Japan on a fake Dominican passport. He was accompanied by two women, one of whom was obviously his wife, while another was likely to be a servant, as well as by a child. When questioned by immigration authorities, Kim Jong-nam admitted his true identity and explained that he just wanted to visit Disneyland. It was widely reported that this incident led to a falling out between the Kim Jong-nam and his father, and these claims are based on hearsay. It is clear, however, that over the last decade, Kim Jong-nam has spent most of his time in Macau and China, and seldom visits Pyongyang. He was not even seen at his father's funeral in December 2011. Reputedly, he runs the Kim family's finances from these locations, but the exact nature of his activities in Macau remain murky. When Kim Jong-il finally made his choice for successor, he's decided to promote his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, who was probably born in 1983. His exact age was never known with certainty. Kim Jong-un was educated in Switzerland, where all children of Marshal Kim attended high school. Not much is known about the youngest Kim. Even his name for a long time was misspelled in the media. Obviously, after a few years in Switzerland, Kim Jong-un was brought back home and received some individual training at Kim Il-sung University. Kim Jong-il finally made up his mind in late 2008, soon after he suffered a serious health problem, apparently a stroke. This might have reminded him about his own mortality, so in early 2009 he spread word among North Korea's bureaucrats and the party faithful that a new genius of leadership had emerged from within the ancient lands of Korea. By the summer of 2009, the propaganda began to target virtually everybody, and the name of the young great General Kim, or New Star General, was frequently invoked at regular indoctrination sessions. Propagandists did not explicitly state that the new shining star of political wisdom was somehow related to Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. The succession became semi-official in September 2010 when the Korean Workers' Party held its conference, the first official convention the party top brass since the 1980 KWP Congress. On the eve of the conference, Kim Jong-un and his aunt, Kim Kyung-hae, were promoted to the rank of 4-star general, becoming perhaps the world's youngest person and the world's only woman, respectively, to hold such rank. At the same conference, Kim Jong-un was appointed deputy chairman of the Central Military Committee of the party, a previously unimportant institution that has now been brought to the administrative forefront of the North Korean government. Since then, the North Korean media began to report Kim Jong-un's activities. He often appeared in the company of his father whilst visiting military units and model factories, or chatting with steel workers and tractor drivers. Paeans to his wisdom and talent began to appear in the media with increasing frequency. When Kim Jong-un was first introduced in the North Korean public in September 2010, he appeared clad in a Mao suit, which was completely identical to the attire his grandfather used to sport in the 1950s. Nowadays, such a suit is decisively out of fashion, so the young general's choice of clothes had clear political connotations. It showed that he was a rightful successor to the dynasty once founded by his grandfather. It helps, of course, that Kim III has a striking resemblance to Kim Il-sung, and not just because he's so unusually stout for a North Korean. To emphasize Kim Jong-un's connection to his father, a similar visual message was employed. In winter, the youngest Kim appeared before cameras in a gray parka and a fur hat that was completely identical to those of his father. In such ways, the average North Korean was reminded that their country would eventually be run by a reincarnation of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. The choice of Kim Jong-un as a successor was somewhat unexpected. Prior to 2008, his candidacy was not seriously considered by Pyongyang. The choice of Kim Jong-un as successor was somewhat unexpected. Prior to 2008, his candidacy was not seriously considered by Pyongyangologists, since he was seen as excessively young and lacking in tangible experience. He spent a large part of his career overseas, while as a youngster he led a secluded life in the palaces of the Kim family. He probably doesn't know much about the country he has to run, and most of the North Korean dignitaries in their late 60s, 70s, and 80s could easily be his grandparents. It was most likely assumed that for a while Kim Jong-un would remain a figurehead, assisted by a team of experienced advisors. It is important that in 2009 to 2010 was a time when Kim Jong-il's sister, Kim Hyung-hee, and her husband, Chang Song-taek, rose to the summit of political power in North Korea. Kim Kyung-hee, who spent most of her life as the top manager of North Korea's light industry, not exactly a success area, was in 2010 promoted to the rank of full 4-star general. In all probability, Kim Jong-il reasoned that the relatively young Kim and Chang couple, they are in their mid-60s, would make the best regents for his inexperienced son. Probably such an arrangement was also welcomed by the entire old guard, who assumed that a young and inexperienced leader would have no choice but to hew to their advice, so that even after Kim Jong-il's death, they would run the country as they pleased, for at least a few years. Not everyone was happy about the decision, but no sane North Korean would express his or her doubts openly. The only exception was Kim Jong-un's semi-exiled half-brother Kim Jong-nam, who hinted that the decision might be problematic while still confirming his loyalty towards the family. In October of 2010, during an unusually long and frank interview with the Japanese Asahi TV, he said, "Personally, I oppose hereditary succession for 3 generations, but I presume there were internal reasons. We should abide by such reasons, if there are any." See Note 22. In January of 2011, during a short interview with Tokyo Shimbun, he was even more frank. Reportedly, he said, "Even Chairman Mao Zedong of China did not enforce hereditary succession. Hereditary succession does not fit with socialism, and my father was against it as well. My understanding is that the power succession is intended to stabilize the internal system. North Korea's instability North Korea's instability leads to instability in the region. See Note 23. In the second half of the same interview, he allegedly added that, in the particular situation of North Korea, reforms and openness might lead to regime collapse. The sudden beginning of a new era. When, at noon on December 19, 2011, the people of North Korea saw the close of a new anchorwoman from their TV set, they probably guessed instantly what happened. Clad in mourning attire and tearful, the announcer delivered the big news. North Koreans were informed that Kim Jong-il had died 2 days earlier during the morning of December 17th. It was stated that he was on his famous palatial train en route to provide on-the-spot guidance somewhere in the countryside. This statement has since been put into doubt, but the exact circumstances of his death are not that important. Whenever and however he died, the 17-odd years of his rule came to an abrupt end. At the time of Kim Jong-il's demise, few doubted that Kim Jong-un was meant to become his successor. Nonetheless, it was by no means a foregone conclusion that the second dynastic transition would go smoothly. It seemed that Kim Jong-il had been expecting to live a few years longer than he actually did. Obviously, he and his entourage assumed that he would have had 3 to 7 years at their disposal to prepare a smooth transition and train Kim Jong-un for his new duties and responsibilities. It is often overlooked that Kim Jong-un had not been explicitly proclaimed the successor as his father. Of course, the way the media treated him left no doubt about his destiny. Nonetheless, the moment of Kim Jong-il's death, Kim Jong-un was technically merely a 4-star general, one of a dozen top military officers, 4-star generals, vice marshals, and marshals of the Korean People's Army, even though admittedly by far the youngest of them all. He was also a vice chairman of the party's Central Military Commission, a rather obscure part of the Korean Workers' Party structure, which has played only a minor political role since the mid-1970s. Obviously, it was assumed that in the near future Kim Jong-un would finally be proclaimed successor and officially made second-in-command to his father. It might be surmised that Kim Jong-un's official promotion to heir designate was initially scheduled to take place amidst the expected gala celebration of Kim Il-sung's 100th birthday in April 2012. However, Kim Jong-il died before these plans could be brought to fruition. However, this uncertainty had little immediate impact on subsequent events. Within days after Kim Jong-il's death, the North Korean media extolled the masses to switch their loyalty to Kim Jong-un. In quick succession, Kim Jong-un was immediately made Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army and acquired the title Supreme Leader. His name began to appear in bold script in the official publications. In a curious and Orwellian twist, the North Korean propagandists edited the older copies of the regime's official newspaper, so in the online PDF archive, the name of the Supreme Leader appears in bold, even in the issues from early 2011, when it was not actually spelled this way. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the dynastic transition is that it went so smoothly without anything unexpected occurring. Everything happened, more or less, completely in line with what was predicted by Pyongyangologists. Kim Jong-un inherited power without any visible challenge, even though his immediate inferiors in the hierarchy could easily be his parents and even grandparents. As expected, for the first months of his rule, Kim Jong-un was surrounded by a trio of advisors: Chung Sung-taek, Kim Kyung-hee, and Lee Young-ho. Kim Kyung-hee has been slightly pushed aside by her husband and has featured less prominently than most experts expected. In most other dictatorships, such an embarrassingly young and politically inexperienced dictator would almost certainly face a challenge from within the inner circle. This did not happen in North Korea so far, and with good reason. The Pyongyang decision-makers are aware that any instability might have grave consequences for all members of the elite. An open clash at the top is likely to provoke political chaos, in which winners and losers alike will perish. In other words, it seems that North Korean leaders have internalized the dictum of Benjamin Franklin, who famously said, "Gentlemen, we must now all hang together, or we most assuredly shall hang separately." With his own shortcomings, this young and somewhat comical-looking rotund man is the embodiment of legitimacy in North Korea. He belongs to the Paektu bloodline, and he is the son and grandson of the top leaders. In the modern world, this might appear to be a weak, even bizarre foundation to build a political power structure upon, but the North Korean leadership, surrounded by a hostile world and presiding over potentially dangerous subjects, have nothing better. The North Korean media had no time to build up a sufficiently impressive personality cult of their new leader. After all, Kim Jong-il was successor for 20 years before his father's death, but Kim Jong-un had just over 1 year. So one should not be surprised that Kim Jong-il still remains the most frequently mentioned personality in North Korean media, and soon after his death, Marshal Kim Jong-il even got a promotion on February 14, 2012. He became a generalissimo. Kim Jong-un began to follow his father's routine. He had been frequently shown doing on-the-spot guidance in military units and collective farms across the country. His wisdom and warmth has been much extolled by North Korean TV, has hastily produced a documentary about his greatness. This is where we can see footage of the supreme leader getting out of a tank and toying with a rifle. In other words, everything has continued much as before. The only difference initially being that Kim Jong-un, unlike his father, was quite willing to deliver public speeches. Soon after Kim Jong-un's ascension on December 30th, the National Defense Commission issued a statement where the North Korean top leadership said explicitly, "We declare solemnly and confidently that the foolish politicians around the world, including the puppet group in South Korea, should not expect any change from us." There were some unusual occurrences nonetheless. For instance, on February 29, 2012, North Korea signed what became known as the Leap Day Agreement with the U.S. representatives in Beijing. This agreement was concluded after years of nearly complete breakdown of the lines of communication between Pyongyang and Washington. The agreement gave North Korea 240,000 tons of food aid in exchange for their assurances that they would refrain from testing nuclear devices and/or missiles. To the great surprise of all observers, and to the great annoyance of the doves in Washington, North Korea almost immediately reneged on the agreement and announced what it called a peaceful satellite launch. The test was carried out on April 13th. The reasoning behind the launch following such an agreement remains unclear. The agreement was broken within weeks of it being signed and did not seemingly bring any benefit to Pyongyang. Not a single ton of food was delivered. Infighting in the bureaucracy or a lack of communication between different agencies in the North Korean government seem to be plausible explanations. The missile launch, along with the fallout following its failure, was rather unusual in and of itself. North Korea announced its intention to launch a satellite into space well in advance and even invited foreign journalists to come and witness these momentous events. The rocket failed 90 seconds after launch. In an unprecedented move, the North Korean government explicitly and almost immediately admitted failure. This was quite remarkable. The three previous launches, 1998, 2006, and 2009, of long-range missiles had all ended in failure as well, but the North Korean authorities had officially insisted that the 1998 and 2009 launches were both successes, while the attempted 2006 launch was never mentioned in the North Korean media whatsoever. By openly admitting this time that the satellite did not reach the orbit, Kim Jong-un took an unprecedented step, in effect acknowledging the technical failures are possible even in his country, blessed with Juche science though it is. The real changes, however, could only be observed somewhat later in summer. In July 2012, Kim Jong-un came to the concert of a newly established pop music group named Moran Bong, which is the name of a very famous scenic hill park in downtown Pyongyang. The official media reported that the group would greatly contribute to the further development and construction in People's Korea. Well, perhaps the group's first concert was rather unlike anything North Korea has ever seen. To start, the female performers who comprised the group were dressed rather risque by North Korean standards. The music performed included the theme from Hollywood movie Rocky and a song by Frank Sinatra. While this music was being performed, actors dressed as Mickey and Minnie Mouse, Winnie the Pooh, and Tigger too, to quote A.A. Milne, were on the stage. Disney lawyers even felt obligated Disney lawyers even felt obliged to release a statement soon afterward confirming that they had not been involved nor received prior permission for the concert. There was no doubt that this display of cuddly creatures on national TV was supposed to be a media event. Kim Jong-un himself was present, and his august presence left little doubt that this combination of risque dress and American pop culture icons had his unconditional approval. Up until now, America had been presented as a source of capitalist decadence, lust, and sleaze, with its popular culture vilified as an embodiment of abnormal and immoral qualities. Admittedly, icons of Disney cartoons are by no means unknown to many North Koreans living in major cities. They are often present on kids' apparel and toys imported from China and sold in the marketplace. But there is a difference between tolerating the presence of Mickey Imperialist Mouse on personal property and promoting him to stardom via national TV. Kim Jong-un was not alone at the concert. He was accompanied by a mysterious, beautiful woman dressed impeccably in black. Soon after, the same woman would be seen on a number of other public occasions by the side of the supreme leader. Many Pyongyang watchers began to speculate about who she was, the vast majority quickly concluding that she was likely to be Kim's wife. Speculation was not to last long, however, as North Korean media soon explained who she was. Her name was Ri Sol-ju, and Kim Jong-un had indeed married her. She has subsequently accompanied her husband quite a few times, talking to kids in a kindergarten, greeting generals at a military meeting, riding a roller coaster, and enjoying the company of a young seal in Pyongyang Zoo, often sporting the latest Dior bag. By North Korean standards, this is all but unprecedented. In Kim Il-sung's first wife, Kim Jong-suk, was eventually made into a major object of personality cult, but she was completely unknown in her lifetime. His second wife would enjoy a brief spell of political prominence, and perhaps had major political ambitions in the 1970s, but she would soon fade into obscurity and would only appear in public when her husband met visiting foreign dignitaries who happened to come to North Korea with their spouses. Kim Jong-il was even more strict in this regard, so none of his numerous wives and live-in girlfriends ever appeared in public in that role. His last mistress, Kim Ok, occasionally accompanied him during overseas trips, but her true identity was never admitted, and she was officially just a member of the delegation. Both the open endorsement of Western pop culture and the willingness to show off his beautiful wife might be attributable to Kim Jong-un's less than advanced age, as well as his desire to make his country into a less boring place. After all, he had just recently been a Swiss schoolboy, an admirer of gadgets and pop music. However, these actions also indicate that he is at least willing to experiment with new ideas and challenge the existing norms of public behavior. It has subsequently become clear that Kim Jong-un does not merely want to change cultural and symbolic things alone. On July 17, the first visible crack appeared in the seemingly cohesive North Korean elite. On that day, at a special meeting of the Politburo, Vice Marshal Lee Yong-ho, a member of the de facto Regency trio, was suddenly ousted from all his official posts. The official explanation was health problems, but almost nobody took this seriously. Lee Yong-ho's removal was probably another sign of the ongoing rise of party apparatchiks and industrial managers who are pushing aside the generals. Some of these people are probably more inclined to experiment than are the top brass in the military. Around the same time, reports about changes in agricultural management began to appear. From the little that is known about the new agricultural policies, it appears that these reforms are relatively piecemeal if compared to Chinese reforms in the 1980s, but quite similar to the initial experiments that took place in the 1970s. Under the system that is to be implemented in a small number of trial areas, farmers will be permitted to dispose of, at market price, all that they produce in excess government quotas. Concurrently, rumors about imminent changes in industrial management began to circulate as well. Does this mean that Kim Jong-un is inclined to steer North Korea towards Chinese-style reforms? It is of course too early to say for certain, but it seems the young dictator wants to run things somewhat differently. He wants to break with at least some of the established traditions of his father's regime. He seemingly does not share the fear his father and his father's advisors had about the likely political consequences of reform. Of course, this does not mean that these fears were and are unfounded and paranoid. On the contrary, it might be that the behavior of a former pupil at a Swiss private school is indeed reckless and dangerously adventurous, if judged from the elite point of view. It is too early to say whether Kim Jong-un will be able to proceed with more changes, even though it seems likely, and whether his desire for change will be translated into comprehensive reformist strategy. Opponents from reform may succeed in removing him from power or persuade him that, in the particular case of North Korea, reforms are too risky, as reforms indeed seem to be. And of course, if young Kim succeeds in thwarting the opposition, he will still have to face the forces his policy will unleash. His well-experienced and street-smart father avoided changes because he believed that such forces would be too powerful to control. It remains to be seen whether much younger Kim Jong-un, who probably learned a significant part of his politics from computer games, will be able to control these forces of popular discontent and escalating political expectations. Be that as it may, the second succession in North Korea is sure to bring us more surprises than the first did in 1994. The City of Monuments. Pyongyang is usually presented as an ancient city, and this, in a sense, is really the case. The area has been the site of a major settlement for nearly 2 millennia. However, the present Pyongyang was built almost from scratch in the mid-1950s. This was largely the result of a major U.S. bombing campaign that reached its height in 1952. The U.S. command had hoped to bomb the North Korean government into submission, and by the end of the war, some 90% of the city ceased to exist, and most of its population had fled to the countryside. Reconstruction began in the 1950s. From the very beginning, the new government wanted to build an exemplary communist city free from reactionary traces of the feudal and imperialist past. Kim Il-sung was quite explicit when he said, "There were many defects in Pyongyang because it was built in an uncultured and lopsided way under Japanese imperial rule." The skyline that emerged owed much to the late Stalin's Soviet Union. Indeed, many parts of the 1950s and 60s Pyongyang look exactly like the Soviet provincial city in the same period. At the time, many important positions in the construction industry were occupied by Soviet Koreans who would later be purged and accused of wrecking. The center of 1960s Pyongyang was called Stalin Street, eventually renamed Victory Street. However, a new round of major construction began in Pyongyang in the 1970s. This was a time when most of the major landmarks of modern North Korea were erected. On the hill overlooking the Taedong River, a great statue of Kim Il-sung was erected. Behind that, the Museum of Korean Revolution was built. Not far from there, one could see the Mansudae Theater, where the exemplary revolutionary operas were performed in the 1970s. The large central square, predictably named after Kim Il-sung, was topped off with a mammoth people's study house. Most of these structures broke with earlier Soviet heritage and were built in a mock traditional style, but still with a touch of characteristic megalomania. On the opposite side of the Taedong River, a tower to the Juche idea was erected in 1982. The general shape of the Juche Tower duplicates that of the Washington Monument in the U.S. Capitol, but exceeds it in size. The tower is 150 meters high and is crowned with a 20-meter-high torch that is illuminated at night. The tower includes 25,550 granite blocks, one for each day Kim Il-sung lived by the time the monument was unveiled. And of course, there was a great many high-rise apartment buildings constructed in the 1970s and 80s. Some of these high-rise quarters are actually off-limits to normal Pyongyangites, including a large district near the 35-story Koryo Hotel. This is where Central Committee officials live behind the high fences. However, contrary to what a short-term visitor might think, the majority of Pyongyangites do not live in these apartments. One merely has to go to the Juche Tower in order to get a real idea about how the living quarters of Pyongyang are structured. With the exception of government residence areas, multi-story apartment buildings serve as screens that stand on the perimeter of districts. inside of which one can see clusters of humble traditional dwellings that are not so different from village houses. On the outskirts of the city, no one bothered to try to disguise these houses, and they are readily visible. The construction boom ended abruptly in the late 1980s when the Soviet subsidies dried up. That said, the sad, if somewhat comical, history of the Rudyung Hotel is a reminder of it. This 110-story, as yet unfinished hotel was meant to be the largest hotel in East Asia. Initially, it was meant to be completed in 1989, but due to economic crisis, work stopped, and for 2 decades, the skyline of Pyongyang was dominated by a gigantic concrete pyramid. Official photographers worked hard to make sure it was never seen in official photographs. But very recently, a new construction boom has begun in Pyongyang. New high-rise buildings and monuments started to appear after 2007, and even the ugly Rudyung Hotel was finally glassed, thanks to a deal with an Egyptian mobile phone company. However, it remains to be seen whether the Rudyung will ever be opened to the public. It might just be for show, like other things in Pyongyang. The city of Pyongyang was built to be a visual representation of paradise, as imagined by Kim Il-sung and his fellow guerrilla partisans. They have probably achieved what they wanted, but one cannot be sure whether outsiders are sufficiently impressed by the results of their efforts.